Section 16 of Little Journeys to the Homes of Great Scientists. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Little Journeys to the Homes of Great Scientists by Elbert Hubbard. Linnaeus, Part 2. The year spent by Linnaeus under the roof of Dr. Rothman was a pivotal point in his life. He was 18 years old. The contempt of Rothman for the refinements of education appealed to the young man. Rothman was blunt, direct, and to the point. He had a theory that people grew by doing what they wanted to do, not by resisting their impulses. He was both friend and comrade to the boy. They rode together, dissected animals and plants, and the young man assisted in operations. Linnaeus had the run of the doctor's library, and without knowing it, was mastering physiology. "I would adopt him as my son," said Rothman, "but I love him so much that I am going to separate him from me. My roots have struck deep in the soil. I am like the human trees told of by Dante, but the boy can go on." And so Rothman sent him along to the University of Lund, with letters to another doctor still more cranky than himself. This man was Dr. Kilian Stobæus, a medical professor, physician to the king, and a naturalist of note. Stobæus had a mixed-up museum of minerals, birds, fishes, and plants. Everybody for 100 miles who had a curious thing in the way of natural history sent it to Stobæus. Into this medley of strange and curious things Linnaeus was plunged with orders to straighten it up. There was a German student also living with the doctor, working for his board. Linnaeus took the lead and soon had the young German helping him catalogue the curios. The Spirit of Ray had gotten abroad in Germany, and Ray's books had been translated and were being used in many of the German schools. Linnaeus made a bargain with the German student that they should speak only German. He wanted to find what was locked up in those German books on botany. Stobæus was lame and had but one eye, so he used to call on the boys to help him, not only to hitch up his horse but to write his prescriptions. Linnaeus wrote very badly, and was chided because he did not improve his penmanship, for it seems that in the olden times physicians wrote legibly. Linnaeus resented the rebuke, and was shown the door. He was gone a week when Stobæus sent for him, much to his relief. This little comedy was played several times during the year, through what Linnaeus afterward acknowledged as his fault. One would hardly think that the man who, on first seeing the English gorse in full bloom, fell on his knees, burst into tears of joy, and thanked God that he had lived to see this day, would have had a fiery temper. Then further, the gentle spiritual qualities that Linnaeus in his later life developed give one the idea that he was always of a gentle nature. In indexing the museum of Dr. Stobæus, Linnaeus found his bent. "I will never be a doctor," he said, "but I can beat the world on making a catalogue." And thus it was. His genius lay in classification. He indexed and catalogued the world, a great writer has said. After a year at the University of Lund, with more learned by working for his board than at school, there was a visit from Dr. Rothman, who had just dropped in to see his old friend Stobæus. The fact was, Rothman cared a deal more for Linnaeus than he did for Stobæus. "Weeds develop into flowers by transplanting only," said Rothman to Linnaeus. You need a different soil. Get out of here before you get pot bound." "But about Cyclops?" asked Linnæus. "Let Cyclops go to the devil." It was no use to ask permission of Stobæus. Linnæus was so valuable that Stobæus would not spare him. So Linnæus packed up and departed between the dawn and the day, leaving a letter stating he had gone to Upsala because it seemed best, and begging forgiveness for such seeming ingratitude. When Linnæus got to Upsala, he found a letter from Dr. Cyclops, written in wrath, requesting him never again to show his face in Lund. Rothman also lost the friendship of Stobæus for his share in the transaction. When Linnæus arrived at Upsala, he had one marked distinction, according to his own account. He was the poorest student that had ever knocked at the gates of the university for admittance. Perhaps this is a mistake, for even though the young man had patched his shoes with birch bark, he was not in debt; and the youth of 21 who has health, hope, ambition and animation is not to be pitied. Poverty is only for the people who think poverty. It is 500 English miles from Lund to Upsala. After his long weary tramp, Linnæus sat on the edge of the hill and looked down at the scattered town of Upsala in the valley below. A stranger passing by pointed out the college buildings, where 1,000 young men were being drilled and disciplined in the mysteries of learning. "Where is the botanical garden?" asked the newcomer. It was pointed out to him. He gazed on the sight, carefully studied the surrounding landscape, and mentally calculated where he would move the botanical garden as soon as he had control of it. Let us anticipate here just long enough to explain that the Upsala Botanical Garden now is where Linnæus said it should be. It is a most beautiful place, lined off with close-growing shrubbery. After traversing the winding paths, one reaches the lecture hall, built after the Greek, with porches peristyle and gently ascending marble steps. On entering the building, the first object that attracts the visitor is the life-size statue of Linnæus. To the left, a half-mile away, is the old cathedral, a place that never much interested Linnæus, but there now rests his dust, and in windows and also in storied bronze his face, form and fame endure. In the meantime we have left the young man sitting on a boulder looking down at the town ere he goes forward to possess it. He adjusts his shoes with their gaping wounds, shakes the dust from his cap, and then takes from his pack a faded neck scarf, puts it on, and he is ready. Descending the hill he forgets his lameness, waves the stone bruises, and walks confidently to the botanical garden, which he views with a critical eye. Next he inquires for the general superintendent, who lives near. The young man presents his credentials from Rothman, who describes the youth as one who knows and loves the flowers, and who can be useful in office or garden, and is not above spade and hoe. The superintendent looks at the pink face, touched with bronze from days in the open air, notes the long yellow hair, beholds the out-of-door look of fortitude that comes from hard and plain fare, and inwardly compares these things with the lack of them in some of his students. "But this doctor, Dr. Rothman, who wrote this letter, I do not have the honour of knowing him," says the superintendent. "Ah, you are unfortunate," replies the youth. "He is a very great man, and I myself will vouch for him in every way." Oh, this glowing confidence of youth, before there comes a surplus of lime in the bones or the touch of winter in the heart! The superintendent smiled. "Knock in faith and the door shall be opened, and there are those whom no one can turn away." A stray bed was found in the garret for the stranger, and the next morning he was earnestly at work cataloguing the dried plants in the herbarium, a task long delayed because there was no one to do it. The study of natural history in the University of Upsala was at this time at a low ebb. It was like the art department in many of the American colleges, its existence largely confined to the school catalogue. There were many weeks of biting poverty and neglect for Linnæus, but he worked away in obscurity and silence and endured, saying all the time, "The sun will come out, the sun will come out." Dr. Olaf Rudbeck had charge of the chair of botany, but seldom sat in it. His business was medicine. He gave no lectures, but the report was that he made his students toil at cultivating in his garden, this to open up their intellectual pores. In the course of his work Linnæus devised a sex plan of classification, instead of the so-called natural method. He wrote out his ideas and submitted them to Rudbeck. The learned doctor first pooh-poohed the plan, then tolerated it, and in a month claimed he had himself devised it. On the scheme being explained to others, there was opposition, and Rudbeck requested Linnæus to amplify his notes into a thesis and read it as a lecture. This was done, and so pleased was the old man that he appointed Linnæus his adjunctus. In the spring of 1730 Linnæus began to give weekly lectures on some topic of natural history. Linnæus was now fairly launched. His animation, clear thinking, handsome face, and graceful ways made his lectures very popular. Science in his hands was no longer the dull and turgid thing it had before been in the university. He would give a lecture in the hall, and then invite the audience to walk with him in the woods. He seemed to know everything: birds, beetles, bugs, beasts, trees, weeds, flowers, rocks and stones were to him familiar. He showed his pupils things they had walked on all their lives and never seen. The old botanical garden that had degenerated into a kitchen garden for the commons was rearranged and furnished with many specimens gathered round about. A system of exchange was carried on with other schools, and natural history at Upsala was fast becoming a feature. Old Dr. Rudbeck hobbled around with the classes, and when Linnæus lectured sat in a front seat, applauding by rapping his cane on the floor and ejaculating words of encouragement. Linnæus was now receiving invitations to lecture at other schools in the vicinity. He made excursions and reports on the natural history of the country around. The Academy of Science of Upsala now selected him to go to Lapland and explore the resources of that country, which was then little known. The journey was to be a long and dangerous one. It meant 4,000 miles of travel on foot, by sledge, and on horseback, over a country that was for the most part mountainous, without roads, and peopled with semi-savages. There were two reasons why Linnæus should make the trip. One was he had the hardihood and the fortitude to do it, and second, he was not wanted at Upsala. He was becoming too popular. One rival professor had gone so far as to prefer formal charges of scientific heresy. He also made the telling point that Linnæus was not a college graduate. The rule of the university was that no lecturer, teacher, or professor should be employed who did not have a degree from some foreign university. Inquiry was made, and it was found that Linnaeus had left the University of Lund under a cloud. Linnaeus was confronted with the charge and declined to answer it, thus practically pleading guilty. So, to get him out of Upsala seemed a desirable thing, both to friends and to foes. His friends secured the commission for the Lapland exploration, and his enemies made no objections, merely whispering, "Good riddance." To be 24, in good health, with hair like that of General Custer, a heart to appreciate nature, a good horse under you, and the commission from the state to do an important work in your left hand breast pocket, what heaven more complete? A reception was tendered the young naturalist in the great hall, and he addressed the students on the necessity of doing your work as well as you can, and being kind. Before beginning his arduous and dangerous journey, Linnaeus went to Lund to visit his old patron, Dr. Stobæus. Time, the great healer, had cured the doctor of his hate, and he now spoke of Linnaeus as his best pupil. He had left hastily by the one light of the moon, without leaving orders where his mail was to be forwarded, but now he was received as an honored guest. All the little misunderstandings they had were laughed over as jokes. From Lund, Linnaeus went to his home in Smaland to visit his parents. It is needless to say that they were very proud of him, and the villagers turned out in great numbers to do him honour, perhaps, in their simplicity, not knowing why. The account of the Lapland trip by Linnaeus is to be found in his book Lachesis Laponica. The journey covered over 4,000 miles and took from May to November, 1731. The volume is in the form of a daily journal, and is as interesting as Robinson Crusoe. There is no night there in summer, but for all this Lapland is not a paradise. It is a great stretch of desert, vast steppes and lofty mountains, with here and there fertile valleys. To be out in the wide open, with no companions but a horse and a dog, filled Linnæus' heart with a wild joy. As he went on, the road grew so rough that he had to part with the horse, which he did with a pang, but the dog kept him company. To be educated is to liberate the mind from its trammels and fears, to set it free, new chiselled from the rock. Linnæus revelled in the vast loneliness of the steppes, and took a hearty satisfaction in the hard fare. His gun and fishing rod stood him in good stead. There were berries at times, and edible barks and watercress, and when this failed he had a little bag of meal and dried reindeer tongues to fall back upon. The simplicity of his living is shown best in the fact that the expenses for the entire journey, occupying 7 months, were only £25, or less than $125. The Academy had set aside £60, and their surprise at having most of the money returned to them, instead of a demand being made for more, won them hand and heart. He had hit the sturdy old burghers in a sensitive spot, the pocket book, and they passed resolutions declaring him the world's greatest naturalist, and voted him a medal, to be cast at his own expense. Fame is delightful, but as collateral it does not rank high. Linnæus was without funds and without occupation. He gave a course of lectures at the university on his explorations, where every seat was taken, and even the stage and windows were filled. The sprightliness, grace, and intellect Linnæus brought to bear illumined his theme. When Linnæus lectured, all classes were dismissed. None could rival him. His very excellence was his disadvantage. Jealousy was hot on his trail, for he was disturbing the balance of stupidity. A movement grew to force him from the college. Formal charges were made, and when the case came to a trial the even tenor of justice was disturbed by Linnæus making an attack on Professor Rosen, his principal enemy, with intent to kill him. Duelling has been forbidden in all the universities of Sweden since the year 1682, and the diversion replaced by quartet singing. So when Linnæus challenged his enemy to fight and warned him he would kill him if he didn't fight, and also if he did, things were in a bad way for Linnæus. The former charges were dropped to take up the more serious, just as when a man is believed to be guilty of murder, no mention is made of his crime of larceny. Poor Linnæus was under the ban. The enemy had won. Linnæus must leave. But where should he go? What could he do? No college would receive him after his being compelled to leave Upsala for riot. He decided that if disgrace were to be his on account of revenge, he would accept the disgrace. He would kill Rosen on sight, and then either commit suicide or accept the consequences. It was all one. And so, laying plans to waylay his victim, he fell asleep and dreamed he had done the deed. He awoke in a sweat of horror. He heard the officers at the door. He staggered to his feet, and was making wild plans to fight the pursuers, when it occurred to him that he had only dreamed. He sat down, faint, but mightily relieved. Then he laughed, and it came to him that opposition was a part of the great game of life. To do a thing was to jostle others, and to jostle and be jostled was the fate of every man of power. He that endureth unto the end shall be saved. The world was before him, the flowers still bloomed, and plants nodded their heads in the meadows. The summer winds blew across the fields of wheat. The branches waved. He was strong. He could plant and plough, or dig ditches, or hew lumber. Someone was hammering on the door. They had been knocking for fully 5 minutes. Ah, there had been no murder, so surely it was not the officers. He arose slowly and opened the door, murmuring apologies. A letter for Carolus Linnæus. The letter was from Baron Reuterholm of Dalecarlia. It contained a draft for £25, as a token of good faith, and begged that Linnæus would accept charge of an expedition to survey the natural resources of Dalecarlia in the same way that he had Lapland, only with greater minuteness. Linnæus read the letter again. The draft fluttered from his fingers to the floor. "Pick that up," he peremptorily ordered of the messenger. He wanted to see if the other man saw it too. The other man did pick it up. Linnæus was not dreaming then, after all. This second expedition had two objects. One was the better education of Baron Reuterholm's two sons, and the other the survey. One of these sons was at the University of Upsala, and he had conceived such an admiration for Linnæus that he had written home about him. No man knows what he is doing. We succeed by the right oblique. Little did Linnæus guess that he was preparing the way for great good fortune. The second excursion was one of luxury. It lacked all the hardships of the first, and involved the management of a party. Reuterholm was a rich Jewish banker, and a man in close touch with all Swedish affairs of state. This time Linnæus was provided with ample funds. Linnaeus had a genius for system, a head for business. He classified men and systematized his work like a general in the field. There were 7 young naturalists in the party, and to each Linnaeus assigned a special work, with orders to hand in a written report of progress each evening. That the economist or steward of the party was an American lends an especial note of interest for us. After Dalecarlia, it was to be America. In money matters he was punctilious and accurate, the result of his early training in making both ends meet. The habits of thrift, industry, energy, and absolute honesty had made him a marked man. There is not so much competition along these lines. The maps, measurements, drawings, and the exact, short, sharp military reports turned in at regular intervals to the baron won that worthy absolutely. Linnaeus was a businessman as well as a naturalist. It would require a book to tell of the glorious half-gypsy life of these 8 young men, moving slowly through woods, across plains, over mountains and meadows, studying soil, rocks, birds, trees and flowers, collecting and making records. Camping at night by flowing streams, awakening with the dawn and cooking breakfast by the campfire in a silence that took up their shouts of laughter in surprise and echoed them back from the neighboring hills. At last the journey was ended. Linnaeus had proved his ability to teach. His animation, good cheer and friendly qualities brought his pupils very close to him. Reuterholm insisted that he should attach himself to the rising little college at Falun. There he met Dr. Moreus, a man of much worth in a scientific way. At his house Linnaeus made his home. There was a daughter in the household, Sarah Elizabeth, tall, slender, appreciative and studious. One of the Reuterholms had courted her, but in vain. There were the usual results, and when Carolus and Sarah Elizabeth came to Dr. Moreus hand in hand for his blessing, he granted it as good men always do. Then the doctor gave Linnaeus some good advice. Go to Holland or somewhere and get a doctor's degree. The enemies at Upsala called Linnaeus the gypsy scientist. Silence them. Linnaeus was now a great man, and the world would yet acknowledge it. Sarah Elizabeth agreed in all of the propositions. Love, they say, is blind, but sometimes love is a regular telescope. This time love saw things that the learned men of Upsala failed to discover. Their diagnosis was wrong. Linnaeus had prepared a thesis on intermittent fever, and he was assured that if he presented this thesis at the medical school at Harderwijk, Holland, with letters from Baron Reuterholm and Dr. Moreus, it would secure him the much desired M.D. A few months at most would suffice. He could then return to Falun and take his place as a practicing physician and a professor in the college, marry the lady of his choice, and live happy ever afterward. So he started away southward. In due time he arrived at Harderwijk and read his thesis to the faculty. Instead of the callow youth, such as they usually dealt with, they found a practised speaker who defended his points with grace and confidence. The degree was at once voted, and a cum laude thrown in for good measure. Linnaeus was asked to remain there and give a course of lectures on natural history. This he did. Before going home he thought he would take a little look in on Leyden, at that time the book-making and literary centre of the world. At Leyden he met Gronovius, the naturalist, who asked him to remain and give lectures at the university. He did so, and incidentally showed Gronovius the manuscript of his book on the new system of botanic classification. Gronovius was so delighted that he insisted on having the book printed by the Plantins at his own expense. Here was a piece of good fortune Linnæus had not anticipated. Linnæus now settled down to read the proofs and help the work through the presses, but he never idled an hour. He studied, wrote, and lectured, and made little excursions with his friends through the fields. The book finished, he hastened to send copies back to Falun to Sarah Elizabeth, saying he must see Amsterdam and then go to Antwerp to visit his new-found printer friends there, and then go home. At Amsterdam he remained a whole year, living at the house of Burman, the naturalist. The wealthy banker Clifford, first among amateur botanists of his day, invited Linnæus to visit him at his country house at Hartekamp. Here he saw the finest garden he had ever looked upon. Clifford had copies of Linnæus's book, and he now insisted that the author should remain, catalogue his collection, and issue the book with the help of the Plantins, all without regard to cost. It took a year to get the work out, but it yet remains one of the finest things ever attempted in a book-making way on the subject of botany. About the same time, with the help of Clifford, Linnæus published another big book of his own called Fundamenta Botanica. This book was taken up at Oxford and used as a textbook, in preference to Ray. Linnæus received invitations from England and was persuaded to take a trip across to that country. He visited Oxford and London, and was received by scientific men as a conquering hero. He saw Garrick act, and heard George Frederick Handel, where the crowd was so great that a notice was posted requesting gentlemen to come without swords, and ladies without hoops. Handel composed an aria in his honour. Returning to Leyden, Linnæus was urged by the municipality to remain and rearrange the public flower gardens and catalogue the rare plants at the university. This took a year, in which 3 more books were issued under his skilful care. He now started for home in earnest, by way of Paris, with what a contemporary calls a trunkful of medals. Paris, too, had honours and employment for the great botanist, but he escaped and at last reached Falun. He had been gone nearly 4 years, and during the interval had established his place in the scientific world as the first botanist of the time. "It was love that sent me out of Sweden, and but for love I would never have returned," he wrote. Linnæus and Sarah Elizabeth were married June 26, 1739. Now the unexpected happened. Upsala petitioned Linnæus to return, and the man who headed the petition was the one who had driven him away, and who came near being killed for his pains. Linnæus and his wife went to Upsala, rich, honoured, beloved. Linnæus shifted the scientific centre of gravity of all Europe to a town, practically to them obscure, a thing they themselves scarcely realized. Henceforth the life of Linnæus flowed forward like a great and mighty river. Everything made way for him. He was invited by the King of Spain to come to that country and found a school of science, and so lavish were the promises that they surely would have turned the head of a lesser man. Universities in many civilized countries honoured themselves by giving him degrees. In 1761 the King of Sweden issued a patent of nobility in his honour, and thereafter he was Carl von Linn. In England he was known as Sir Charles Linn. Sainte-Beuve, the eminent French critic, says that the world has produced only about half a dozen men who deserve to be placed in the first class. The elements that make up this superior man are high intellect, which abandons itself to the purpose in hand, careless of form and precedent, indifference to obstacles and opposition, and a joyous, sympathetic, loving spirit that runs over and inundates everything it touches, all with no special thought of personal pleasure, gratification, or gain. Linnaeus seems in every way to fill the formula. End of section 16. Recording by Shena Ser, Fresno, California.